There we are. Okay. So good afternoon and welcome to this webinar, Insights on the Tropical Malaysian House. It's time to coincide with the publication of the book bearing that title. We have over 500 participants registered for today's event, and we welcome guests from Australia, from Singapore, and from the United Kingdom. The Tropical Malaysian House follows the Tropical Malaysian House 2 follows Tropical Malaysian House 1, published 18 months ago in December 2018. Together, these two books attempt to distill the essence of the contemporary Malaysia dwelling from 51 houses designed by 34 architects and designers. The houses represent some of the best domestic architecture in Malaysia in the last decade. The Tropical Asian House 1 essentially focused upon defining the essence of a house in the tropics. In this second book, The Tropical Malaysian House 2, I attempted to explore what imparts a Malaysian identity. So joining me today are 5 truly innovative architects and designers who contributed to the houses in the book. Architect Melvin J. Kanny is a graduate of University College London and South Bank University. Melvin is the architect of 2 houses in the book. The Funnel House, which is at Planters Haven in Nilai, and it's designed for a Malaysian Indian couple who are both engineers. He's also the architect of the Canopy House in UK Heights, Selangor, for a Malay doctor and her Australian husband who works in the oil and gas industry.
Very good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Robert Powell as well as Dr. Tan for initiating this discourse on a Malaysian tropical house. I think it's a really good idea to share knowledge of what tropical architecture is about to the general public. I'm not going to talk so much about the Canopy House as well as the Funnel House. I think if you want to learn more about the house, please buy the book. I'm here to talk more about my journey in discovering what Tropical Malaysian House is. I can say that even up to today, I haven't found all the answers, and every house I learn something new, and hopefully as we keep going, we develop a greater depth into the meaning of what is the Malaysian house. Okay, when I when I first completed my architectural studies back in the UK and came back to Malaysia, I had absolutely no clue what tropical architecture was about. So it was a real eye-opener. In the early 90s, it was people like Jimmy Lim, who was basically the trailblazer as far as tropical Malaysian architecture was concerned, with his houses, his wonderful timber structures that was his own interpretation of the Malay tropical house. So it was a very good time when tropical architecture was actually booming. At the same time, unfortunately, Balinese tropical style was also becoming very well known because I think people with money holidayed in Bali and everyone loved the 4 seasons, and they wanted their own houses to be a replica of the 4 seasons. So I think as architects, we are all a little bit guilty of indulging our clients with Balinese architecture back in the early 90s. But I think there were a few architects who were pushing the boundaries. Kerry Hill, for one, who did the Datai Langkawi, as well as Lek Bunak, who did the Pangkor Laut Resort, who were trying to sort of infuse Malaysian culture into their design. Just to give you a bit of background about my own personal journey, I started off working for a firm called Pentago, who are doing a lot of tropical resorts and houses here in Malaysia and Asia Pacific region. And we started off by doing houses that were very tropical, pseudo-tropical, colonial sort of style, and you know, with colonnades, very high ceiling, very big, airy spaces. And this particular house in Kanny Hills that we worked on was for a gentleman who wanted to have features of the Jeffrey Bawa type of architecture. So it was a real eye opener working on this project. And as we developed along, we looked at sort of modernizing or making architecture a little bit more contemporary, but still sticking with the vernacular language of stone and timber and the vernacular pitch roof. So this house, DVT Bungalow in Seputeh Heights, we did the same thing, but it was a lot. We used a lot of cleaner lines, still adapting the same principles of tropical architecture, but a little bit more contemporary. Then one of my first houses when I started on my own 15 years back was the Sione house up in UK Heights, a small budget project. So in this house, I started to look at creating lightness because I felt that tropical houses were very heavy, especially with the use of timber. So I combined the use of timber with steel, and the whole upper floor is basically steel structures from the roof truss to the columns. And of course, also exploring the agenda of the house becoming part of the garden and vice versa. And then the JW house was done at Country Heights, Damansara. Again, you can see that it's progressed. It's a little bit more contemporary. We're using even smaller members of steel. We replaced concrete columns with steelwork, and the roof design was done with using steel I-beams to keep it really light, so it kind of floats above the house. So you have a sort of a 2 feet high opening, which could be used for lighting and ventilation to come through. Then with the RNA house, I started to experiment and to go away from the vernacular style roofs and see what happens. So this house, we use a steel roof structure, but still keeping the tropical concepts, the tropical ideas of what a house should be. So its relationship with the outside, large overhangs, and in this picture here you see a safari roof, timber louvers to give shade, things like that. And again, the relationship of the building with the outside and how it opens up to the outdoors. And then Kampung Tugu house, which is my house. Actually, when I was preparing for this talk, my wife asked me, "Are you going to present our house?" And I said, "Probably." And she said, "How can you? Ours is not a tropical house. It's just concrete, glass, and steel." So I think the public perception of a tropical house has always been, you must have a lot of timber, a lot of stonework, and which I think is really not true. As long as you keep with the principles of what a tropical house means, I think you can build it out of almost any material. And in this house, we use really, really simple materials like concrete blocks and steel. The house is still very much open to the garden. The pool actually coming into the house, double volume spaces where the air can escape through the roof, in between outdoor and indoor spaces. So all this was incorporated in the tropical sort of spirit, but using very modern materials. Then there was a period where I was exploring roof structures. When you have huge roof overhangs, you can do wonderful things. You can leave the windows open the entire day and rain doesn't come in. With this house, the quadrant house in Spoteh Heights, it was a house on a corner lot. So we designed a fan-shaped steel roof, lightweight steel roof, and organized all the spaces underneath it. And it had a 9-meter span, so it was pushing cantilevered structures to the limit. But what we got from it is that we created all these in-between spaces that allowed light and ventilation to sort of creep into the house. And then about 3 years ago, we did the Jana Baik Villa. The Jana Baik Villa was slightly different in the sense that even though it's tropical, it's up in the Highlands, so it's got a more temperate sort of climate. But we still explored the same ideas. We looked at even creating a wind chimney because we had a lot of cool breeze in that area, and we could tap it and filter it into the house. Double sort of volume spaces with high-level netting to allow free flow of air, natural materials, bricks, concrete, some timber screening to allow for light and ventilation. And again, this house, the roof played quite a prominent role, I think, in the overall design. It's a house that was designed to sort of have a dialogue with the landscape. Then comes Funnel House, which is featured in the Tropical Malaysian House too. This was a fairly simple house, a single-story house. What we were exploring in this house was to use really basic finishes like concrete and brick, and still allow light and a breeze to come into the house. You could open the doors out towards the pool and towards this is on a 1-acre site, so it's a huge garden littered with durian trees. So the house was just orientated towards that huge garden, and air could just come over the pool, and so you get sort of evaporative cooling coming into the house. And we had these high-level motorized windows to allow for the hot air to escape. Again, open spaces, open to the sky. And then the Canopy House. The Canopy House was quite interesting in the sense that it was on a very steep site, class 3, class 4 sort of slope. And it gave rise to an interesting form. We toyed with the idea of the canopy as a reflection of the existing trees. You can see the trees here, they're over 50 feet high. These are huge trees, which we managed to preserve. And the roof is a sort of a reflection of that. So as you enter the site, it just drops down, just an immediate slope down. So we looked at the idea of the roof being a form of a way of inviting you to step down into the house. Again, we had with the roof, you had very interesting spaces created by, well, whether intentionally or accidentally, but it created these little pockets where we could play with windows and openings for light and ventilation to come through. The Falanciti house, coincidentally, is a neighbor of the Canopy house because both owners were friends, and we built the two houses at the same time. So it had a very similar concept in terms of how we approached it, except Falanciti house had a different set of requirements in terms of what the owner wanted. And so the roof form changed, and the internal was actually quite different. But again, the same language of the idea that you are under shelter, right, and protected by this shelter. That's a picture of the bedroom, and we incorporated things like bamboo screens to allow airflow. I mean, this used to be a very common thing in the old days, but we managed to convince our client to have this, despite complaints that aircon, you may lose some cool air. but he's implemented it and he's quite happy. It works quite well. So I think, yeah, so that's basically the last house. So in conclusion, what I'd like to say is that there is no set of rules, I think, in what defines a tropical house. I know a professor has mentioned that, you know, there's certain things that you have to have, like you know, natural ventilation, spaces being open to the sky, and so on and so forth. But I think my approach has always been the process, and I'll talk a little bit about that in my conclusion later on. So it's a process of exploration of light, exploration of materials, exploration of technology. And I think with that, I hope that the houses that we as architects are building will keep evolving and changing as we move forward. All right.
Yeah, but there's a very interesting question. It's one question. It's actually from Frans Mulder. I know Frans from Holland. It says it is interesting to see that the women architects focus a lot on the social function of the house, the soul of the house, while the men architects focus more on the physical structure of the house. This is clearly visible from the presentation. What do you think of that statement? I was going to ask this question myself as to what gender factor here in the design of a tropical house.
I just want to share that, you know, the house we did, the DVT house that we did in Sepote Heights, which was a tropical style house. I worked with my client throughout the whole process. His wife was never really involved. And when the house was finished, she told me, "I don't like the house." And I said, "Why?" "It's too masculine." I said, "Well, what do you mean masculine?" She said, "Well, everything is in a straight line, it's clean lines everywhere. There's no any decorative elements, you know." So I think it also depends. I don't think whether it's a male agenda or a female agenda, because some ladies, I think, prefer, you know, houses that are very clean and very simple. So it's quite subjective, I think.
Okay.
On the humidity, I think it's a false belief that if you have a house with lots of water features, that the house is going to be humid. That's a wrong conception. As long as the house has got plenty of ventilation, there should not be any issues with humidity. Humidity only happens in like basements because it tends to be moist. There's no proper ventilation. So when a house is properly ventilated, that's never an issue.
In this book, we do address some of these problems of cross ventilation or the questions of cross ventilation, and one particular house is house W39. It's designed by Susan Zeidler and Bart Lim, and this is a terrace house, and it's been completely opened to natural ventilation. There's no air conditioning in the house whatsoever, and it's an incredibly pleasant place to live. So it is possible by architectural means to promote cross ventilation. Somebody does pose that question: what is cross ventilation? What I would say is means that as far as possible, a house should be one room wide, so that and it should be orientated properly, if possible, so that it faces the wind, the natural wind flow. But then you use something which most architects are aware of, and that's called the Venturi effect. You have windows on both sides, but you can adjust these windows so that windows on one side are wide open, windows on another side are very narrow spaces. And this introduces into the house a positive and a negative pressure. Wind moves through the house, ventilation moves through the house. And so there are devices there for ventilating a house. That is, for my mind, what cross ventilation is about. I'm reminded by there are so many questions here, and we will try to answer them, not today, I'm afraid, because we've only got 1.5 hours, but we will try to answer these questions after the webinar. But as it's coming close to 10 to 5, I'm going to ask the panelists to give me a few closing statement about the Tropical Asian House. What order shall I do it with? Perhaps I start with you, Melvin. What are your...
Yeah, sure. Can I just share my screen? Sorry,
Okay.
not this one. Yeah, can you guys see that?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. I just want to talk a little bit about, well, I suppose the things I didn't talk about, the things that clients don't normally see, the stuff that architects do that is in the background, but it's really fundamental, especially with creating tropical houses. The studies that we need to do initially, the sketches that we need to do to see how, we talk about cross ventilation, how all this works with the house. And this is an example of the a boomerang house that we just completed. And we did studies of, because again, the roof was very prominent and the roof had a job of keeping the sun out to the open areas. So we did studies from morning, afternoon, and evening. And when the house was completed, we actually took pictures to see how it worked, and it sort of worked exactly as we figured. So if we didn't do the initial studies, you might find that your design intent may not work. So these are actually very important aspects that we as architects look into. Again, this is a canopy house. How the building actually sits on the site, and again how the roof acts in keeping out the rain but allowing air to come in. The phalangery house, we looked at the roof as a structure of a leaf, and from the leaf we actually developed a structural system for the roof based on the idea of the leaf structure. In the funnel house, the house is actually elevated above the ground by about 3 to 4 feet, and we wanted to encourage cool air to actually enter into the rooms. So we had these vented slots that could be open and shut whenever required. In my own house, Kampung Tuku house, we actually did a wind velocity sort of thermodynamic studies in terms of how the wind actually comes into the house and how it exits. So just to make sure that cross ventilation is working and you had enough airspeed movement to keep the house cool. A project that we were working on recently, we were looking at the idea of having bottles put in your windows. This is something done in Bangladesh to keep to keep the rooms cool. And we are developing van blocks, right? That sort of imitates this. And we built models and fixed it in our office windows, and we did tests to see how the slots in the vent affected the temperature and the wind speed. So these are just some examples that we do in all our projects. And I think by looking at this and doing this, we can develop newer, or I suppose invent newer ways of doing things that were done before, but in a different way.
Thank you, Melvin. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to the panelists, to Adela Askanda and Farah Azizan. Thank you, ladies. Thank you to Razin Mahmood. Thank you to Anchi Wee, and thank you to Melvin J. Kanny. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and enjoy your weekends, everyone. Thank you.